Cool. So yes, remember to download the stuff. We will be using it at the end of the lecture for your in-class activity. So prepare yourselves. This week, what we're doing is I struggled with whether I was going to do Premiere, like the color in Premiere as a final like send off for Premiere, or were we going to do an intro to After Effects? And I thought the techniques I talk about in here are actually really important for a lot of people. Talked about, in fact, we'll get to questions from last week, but there was a question talking about, you know, the kinds of effects you see on things, and color being one of them. And so I thought, yeah, let's just do the color talk this week. Next week, we'll start into After Effects, and trust me, you're going to get more After Effects than you can possibly handle anyway. So color correction in Premiere is what we're going to talk about tonight. But first, I wanted to say something. So the quiz just locked like 9 minutes ago, and there's only 17 entries in there. So 17. It's due. It was due today, so I'm not going to review it today. I'll review it next week. But take the quiz. You'll lose a couple points for missing the deadline, but it was up on Saturday. Sorry. Yes.
How many people?
So it'll be open again to take.
It is. Actually, it's not locked out. It's just it'll just say you're submitting this late, and it'll flag it in my, and I'll be like, oh, demerit, and then it's all good. So. But don't miss out. It's 40 points. You don't want to not take it. Okay. All right. So we'll skip through that. We'll go to questions, and then we'll move on to color. So start with some questions. Do edited audio clips that are taken out of Premiere automatically save their changes from Audition back into Premiere? Good question. The point, this goes back to what we call the round trip workflow for sending your audio work from Premiere into Audition and having it return. Now, if you're just doing a single clip in Audition, or if you're taking a single clip and you're editing it in Audition, what usually happens is that if you send it to Audition, it will extract the audio from the video clip, assuming it's a video clip. It'll take the audio, extract it to a WAV file, change the project in Premiere to link to that new WAV file that it just created, and then open Audition with that WAV file so that you can do the changes you want to do. In that case, any changes you make to Audition or in Audition to that WAV file will definitely show up in Premiere. As long as you do that. Yeah, as long as you save the project. If for some reason, good question, if you were to, for instance, open the project, send an audio clip, a single audio clip from a video clip into Audition, and then Premiere crashes without saving it, yeah, you don't have that linkage. This is what I talked about with that whole dynamic linking between the kind of the behind the scenes sleight of hand that Adobe products do when you send media from one program to the other. There's some fragileness there. And if you don't know exactly what's happening, you can get burned, and then you're like, now what? And it can cause real heartburn. David.
I see people do that all the time. Like, you don't put on autosave, or they forget to save, and something crashes. It's not worth not having your autosave.
No, it's not. In fact, what I'm going to do right now is I'm going to give you guys a pro tip. I'm just going to create a quick project here. What I want you to, this is something that you absolutely want to do. Whether you do this in Windows or in Mac, is first thing you do on a workstation if you're going to use this thing. And sadly, the downside to these workstations being the way that they are is that the configuration is wiped every time you reboot the computers. Yeah. But so you get the fun of doing this every time if you want to kind of follow a healthy edit workflow. Again, this is more helpful to you in editing, less Well, it's not that it's not helpful to you in post production, like what we're talking about in this class, but it's still a really important thing to check. So click autosave, and when it comes up, you're going to see that the default preference is that it's going to automatically save every 15 minutes. I don't know about you, but 15 minutes is a lot of work time for me. So my default, every time I sit down to a workstation that I actually am going to edit at, and usually this preference will stay put. So if you have Adobe installed on your own computers, this preference will be sticky, is that you want to make this save about every 5 minutes. Okay? So instead of 15 minutes, 5 minutes. The next field that down says maximum project versions. So this is basically how many audio saves will it keep before it basically deletes the oldest one. By default, it says 200. Now, if you do the math, 5 times 200 is about 100 minutes, hour and a half. That's not long enough of a time frame. I'd like a day's worth of backups if I had to at 5-minute increments. So I put, actually, I generally put like 500 because you'll never actually autosave 500 times. Or you might, and you know, that's fine. But in doing that, you will actually save yourself a ton of headache in the course of oh, and by the way, this project versions, this is per project file. So if you rename your project file every day with a new date, then you've got 500 more backups of your file. Okay. Now, does this take up hard disk space? Yes, it does. Especially as your edit increases and you're doing more things in your edit, your little project file is going to increase in size. But that is small. That's a small price to pay on 4 terabyte hard drives to have a few megabytes extra taken up with backups of your project file, especially because sometimes project files do get corrupted. Sometimes your project does get weird. And so this is a key pro tip, man. Do not miss on this one. Do this on every workstation you can. 5 minutes save intervals and 500 backups or project versions, and you will thank me down the road. You'll be like, damn, I'm so glad Randy told me that tip because it saved my bacon from burning so many times. All right, Lariva.
So then I heard you talk a little bit about it. So I normally save as with the date, so that each day I save my work so that I don't have to go back to the beginning.
Yep. So yeah, and what Lariva's talking about is that when you save a project, you will start saving a project as right now it says untitled, but let's say I saved it as Randy 2018-02-27, or just skip the dashes, 02-27. So this is the name of your project, and then you just put this code on the end of it. When you save that, what ends up happening is if you do have the autosave happening, let me go to, oh, this is under documents. That's right. Adobe, or Premiere 12. Okay, so here's where the file is. If you see an autosave done on this, it's going to be Randy 2018-0227-1-2-3 and so on. So, and it's going to be in the autosave folder where your project is located. At the end of a workday, you might say, okay, it's either at the end of the workday or the beginning of the new workday. The first thing you do when you open your project is you open up your project and then you immediately do save as and put the new date on there. So today, now it's today's date. Now you've basically just created you've moved all everything's the same. It's just renamed to a new date. And now you're ready to work for the new day. And now you've got 500 backups of that file and 500 backups of the file after that, and so on and so on. Definitely, you will not regret this as a healthy editing workflow in Premiere. It will save you. You will thank me someday, but not today. All right. Okay, so back to the question at hand. So that, I mean, the linkage should generally, if you follow all of the ritual forms and the chicken blood is sprinkled just so, then yes, your audio will update automatically into Premiere. If it does not, you might have to re-import that. You might have to go find that audio clip that you saved in Audition, re-import it into your project, and place it into your sequence. Okay? That is absolutely, that's happened to me. I've had to do it. Knowing that that's the workaround if in case the linkage breaks is an important thing for you guys to keep in mind. Okay. So, great question. What exactly is the definition of a Foley sound? Funny thing, Wikipedia, there's a whole entry on Foley. So it's named after a guy who invented the technique. And so anyway, and this is typical of when you think about what a Foley stage looks like. Is it's a sound stage. It's got all kinds of weird surfaces and items. So you're seeing basically this guy is, and look at where the mic is located. The mic is basically pointed at the surface, like, because that's what it's capturing the sound of something hitting that particular kind of surface. And that is what this is about. It might not be, the sound they're capturing might not be a bowling ball hitting concrete. It might be a body hitting concrete. It might be somebody's, some other item hitting concrete. But what they use is a bowling ball because guess what? It's solid resin and pretty durable and will put up with dropping repeatedly onto concrete without destroying it. So that's why they use it. Okay, so the idea of Foley as a craft is absolutely that's a career unto itself. Okay, I don't expect any of you to take up Foley art, Foley sound as your line of work. But if you did, I would love you, because man, I got a soft spot for Foley artists. They're crazy. I mean, just the amount of attention they spend on just how something sounds is you hear it every time you go watch a movie. So just be aware of that. Yeah.
It seems like that field must have changed quite a bit because of digital technology.
You'd be surprised how much it hasn't.
It hasn't really.
Oh no.
That's cool.
Yeah, because you're always looking for just the right sound of something, and they can do an enormous amount of sound in a sound studio, because the beauty of it is that it's perfectly quiet, or at least it's as close to perfectly quiet as you're likely to get without spending absurd amounts of money.
Is there an analog library of those sounds before?
Oh yeah, there's all kinds of libraries full of Foley sounds. Yeah. I mean, in fact, Adobe, I think I talked about it in the Audition when we talked about Audition, is that you can download libraries of sound effects, and there's a whole sections of that are just Foley that were recorded in a Foley studio like this, a soundstage.
So before digital, though, there were also like analog recordings that people used.
Oh yeah.
Oh
yeah. Foley's been around for a long time.
No, I knew that Foley was. I just didn't know if they had like a library, ways that they're digital. Or
there might
like
be.
Each time they wanted to make a sound of someone getting stabbed, they'd stab a head of lettuce.
Sure. Because what they would do is they could, if there was enough money involved, the director of the film would be there listening and going, yeah, that's the sound. And that's it. And it's like, oh yeah, that's perfect. And so usually it's post-production supervisors handling that end of things. But it's the director who owns the creative vision of this. So it's like the sound is the director's purview as well. So anyway, yeah, look it up. It's great. Foley. There's there's lots of podcasts and blogs and other things about sound effect artists and Foley artists doing their jobs. So yeah, you could spend a lot of time working on just keeping up with that. When applying a transition to all the clips by default, how do I change the default time? Again, this is under preferences. So if you go to Premiere Pro and Preferences, I think it might even be under General. Oops. Let's see. No, going to be under, no. Timeline? Timeline. So towards the bottom, you have a video transition default duration and an audio transition default duration. The defaults are 30 frames. It's actually frames. So if you're shooting a 24p, 24 frames per second film, or you're working on a 24 frame per second sequence, the default transition is actually 1 second and 6 frames. So just be aware that if you're normally working in 2398, 24 frames a second, stuff like that, make sure you come in here and change this. If you want this to be shorter, for when I was doing most of my production stuff, I changed the default to 12 frames because I was always trying to do quicker transitions. If I used dissolves at all, it would be quicker dissolves. It wouldn't be over a second because I think a second is too long. However, your taste is and your preference is what it is. So same with audio transitions. Your audio transition, I would put that as a half second, sometimes quarter second, depending. But 1 second is a good basic transition default. And then there's still image duration default, which is if you take a still image and you drag it from your project onto a sequence, how long is that clip going to automatically be? And the default length is 5 seconds. If you want it to be longer, you have to open it in the source viewer. Well, I mean, you can do it a couple ways. Open in the source viewer and then put in and out on the length of time that you want, or drag it to the timeline and just kind of roll out additional, length of that clip so that you can. And then maybe you're going to do a Ken Burns move on things, and you're going to start in one point of the still image and zoom out, or scroll, or pan across, and whatever. Okay, whatever your pleasure. So yeah, it's the preference panels in. So that's two great tips for one class. This one for the autosaves, and then your default durations for transitions. How does sharpening work, and why does it make my image grainy? So the short answer here is that sharpening actually is a technique
It's so different. Gold. That's where I was something.
Check, check.
Yeah.
All right. Back to sleep. Okay. I just checked the stream, and sure enough, the audio was hosed. So I restarted it to not be hosed again. Hopefully, it won't stay unhosed for a while. Yeah, I'm not thrilled either. So, because yeah, that's not the way this is supposed to be. This is supposed to be better than this. All right. So I wanted to quickly kind of circle back with the presentation I was working on. Remember, we talked through the color workspace. And so when you talk about the fast color corrector, which I showed you before, the best way to describe it is it's a good one-trick pony. Does one thing really well, and that is remove a color cast or apply a color cast. It does have auto black level, auto white level, and auto contrast features. Your mileage may vary. They're very much like a levels control that you would find in Photoshop. That's these areas down here. I'm not going to go into them. So fast color corrector. Three-way color corrector that we went through really briefly was the major go-to color tool for people that couldn't afford a colorist. It's like a fast color corrector that has, it has 3 different wheels, one for each of the tonal ranges, whether that's shadows, midtones, or highlights. Again, it does have that same sort of levels control for inputs and output levels. You do have a way to split where the cutoffs for each of these are and what range is applied to the midtones. It does have others. It has like a secondary color stage and other things down here. It was a pretty capable little tool when it was in its prime. Nowadays, everybody starts to talk about lumetri. So let's talk about it. There are 5 stages with the lumetri color control. You have what's called basic correction. Then you have a creative section, a curve section, a color wheel section, and a vignette section. So, and they are applied in order. So the basic is what happens first. And then what happens after that is, so the first thing that affects the pixels that are in your frame or in your video clip is going to be the basic correction. And then the next thing will be the creative group, and then the curves group, and then the color wheels group. So if you need color wheels to be applied before, say, basic correction or creative, you would have to have 2 lumetri color effects applied to your clip. One to do a later stage first, and then a second one to do the other one. But considering that most color workflows fall under this kind of this top-down path, that's why they've set it up this way. This is designed to be easier for you. If you guys remember the sound essentials and the other things in Premiere, these other panels that were available to you under, say, audio, essential sound, or there's an essential graphics panel that you can use for doing graphics applied to your, that are more in vein of Photoshop or Illustrator, other things like that. You can do the same thing for color. They did this first with color, and then they've added these other, kind of easy to control effects. So, that's the basic workflow. Top-down workflow starts with basic correction, works to vignette. Creative is where you can apply looks. Actually, before we move on, so basic correction is where you can apply what is called a lookup table or a LUT to your to handle things like if you know that the camera that you're shooting has it shoots in a very flat gamma, or if God forbid you're shooting with a red camera. I mean that in the nicest possible way. That you can apply a LUT, which will basically give you a basic contrast adjustment for the sensor that you've shot your film on. Then you've got the ability to do white balance and then basic tone, whether that's exposure contrast, dealing with some highlight moves and blacks. Not a whole lot of color capability here. You can affect overall color with saturation, but you really aren't doing too much in the way of color correction here. This is really just exposure and basic contrast correction. All right, next up is the creative group. That's the second tier. This is where you can apply looks with the air quotes again. And that is whether you can, and they are actually referred to as looks in here, and we'll go through them in a second. You can also do adjustments like faded film, which is so common that now there's a slider for it. You can do an overall sharpening move. You can do vibrance, which basically punches certain color groups with a little extra saturation. Not so much skin tones, but other than skin tones, it will increase the saturation of those colors, those hues. And then there's an overall saturation control. Then you have a shadow tint and a highlight tint. This was the, I want to warm the highlights. I want to cool down the shadows. That's where you would do them on these controls. Creative, that's the second group. The third group is color curves. So these are going to be very much like what you've seen in Photoshop. You do actually also have a hue saturation curve, which you do not have in Photoshop, that will allow you to adjust the hue over a range. This can be dealt with. This can actually be used for some color correction, depending. Okay. If you know that there are certain ranges that you need more saturation or less, and there are some specific examples of where you might use this. What comes to mind, not that I would do a film like this, but Sin City, where you'd have very specific splashes of color. Most of that was actually matted by hand or with keying effects, but you could also use something like this to isolate certain color ranges. And as long as nothing else has that color range, then it would look black and white except for that color range. So anyway, yeah, this is a pretty interesting group. You do have color wheels. So just like the three-way color corrector, you do have the ability to deal with shadows, midtones, and highlights as a separate, a separate control group. And then finally, you have the vignette, which gives you a centered vignette on the frame. It is not movable. I mean, again, you can mask this effect. So, some of this is kind of hoo-ha-ha funny. But if you need to have a vignette that is centered on the frame and either brightens the edges or darkens the edges, depending on your point of view, this would be the ability to direct the viewer's attention. Now, like I said, if you want to really direct the viewer's attention, you're going to probably apply a mask and highlight the area that, or brighten the area that you want to direct the viewer's eye toward, and then darken everything else. And that's a different approach. So, parting shots on color before we get started on what we're going to do tonight. A little goes a long way. You saw me kind of monkey around with the fast color corrector and things got out of hand real fast. That absolutely will happen if you are too severe with your moves. If you want to be severe with your moves, if that is a creative direction that you're looking for, that's fine. But if you're looking for something to be kind of canonically in the looks right sort of element of film, a little will go a long way toward increasing your comfort there. Don't be afraid to experiment. You have Control Z or Command Z for a reason. You also have your project backups every 5 minutes for a reason. So, and if you ever really get too far off in the weeds, you can always just delete the effect and reapply it and start over. Metric color is pretty it's pretty fun and easy. It is not. I haven't found that it's a panacea. It doesn't do everything. If you need very nuanced stuff, you're gonna find that it's limited in its ability to fix problems for specific problems. David, you had a question?
Just like a statement.
Okay.
It's always important when you're doing color, check it on what kind of monitor you're using. It could be very warm, it could be cold. And
yep.
Put it on your cell phone. The cell phone's a really good thing to test. Just a quick and easy. Especially
if it's meant to be played on that.
Exactly. So
yeah.
You'll notice if you go onto a stream, it'll be very often. Yep.
And so to that end, yes, you should watch your media, your project, render it off, render off a test of your footage, and put it on your TV at home, put it on your phone, put it on your friend's computer, put it on their phone. I mean, if they have an Android or an iOS, it might look different. It's like as many screens as you can put it on to check your footage against, it will, you'll find out a lot. But it invariably comes back to this, okay? Is that you might say, wow, that looks fantastic on my Apple monitor. And then you render it off and you put it on a TV and you're like, ah! And that's because the TV, the consumer televisions generally don't have the ability to display color that your Apple monitor or your expensive Windows or, you know, PC monitors and PC graphics cards are capable of displaying, are way in excess of what you can find on most consumer televisions. Yeah.
It's kind of analogous to recording. When you're mastering a recording, you mix it in a room, take it out, and you put it in your car to verify it.
Yeah. Because you want to play it on the junkiest device that it's going to be played on so that you can appreciate it.
And absolutely, the room could be, itself could be.
Yes. And I've been there. Okay. And so that's why I put at the last one. It's like, and did I mention it goes a long way. So it is time to now get busy. And here's what we're going to do. Okay. I'll put this back up on the screen once we get started. But you're going to create, if you haven't already, you should have Premiere loaded. You're going to create a project. You're going to import the footage from the week 6 folder. Create 2 sequences. You know, generally speaking, it might be 2398, it might be 20, it might be 30. I don't remember. I might have shot this all in 30 frames a second. But one called contrast, the other called white balance. The idea is that one of these groups, this folder that says low contrast, it's actually not shot low contrast, but it was shot in kind of high dynamic range, but it's trying to flatten some of the contrast range. And then the white balance one is ones where I went off and I shot incorrect color temperatures as much as possible. And so and you will find the limits of what you can adjust. Drop the clips from the low contrast folder into the contrast sequence. Do the same for the white balance sequence. And then you're going to use Lumetri. You could use the 3-way color corrector if you feel like, nostalgia. But use Lumetri and try to adjust them to where they look better. I mean, better with air quotes again, because your taste is going to be yours. But I mean, you will struggle with some of these and they will probably not look great, but that should hopefully drive home some of the key findings of when you are out there creating content, you're capturing footage and you make oh, hey, we had this set to daylight and we were indoors with tungsten. What you're up against is that the color that you're going to get is not going to look that awesome. So, okay. Now I will come back to that, but the idea now, again, I'm going to quickly move over to the editing workflow. I'm going to close this. God, I hate the fact that they put this in. All right. List. And so if you want a quick and dirty way to do this, I'm going to delete this sequence. You can just take these clips and actually drag them, and what it'll do is it'll line up nose to tail all of those clips in one sequence. And you can do the same for the white balance sequence, as you can just go, though here you'd actually have to create a new sequence, or close this one. Yeah, close it. Take these, drag them over, it creates a new sequence and just lines them up nose to tail. All right, so this will give you some ability to play with it. What you're going to do is for the low contrast ones, let's bring this one up. So this is our quote unquote low contrast, which is kind of a joke because it's actually pretty high contrast. Switch to the color workflow. Put the scopes back over. Oh, well, all right. Reset. What I'd like is actually this one's probably not so bad. This one's, well, it has areas where it doesn't have too much dynamic range. This one's another one where it does get a little broad. And of all of them, this one's probably the one that has the least amount. So what I'm talking about is that, you from the brightest to the darkest, you'll notice with this control, with this scope, is that you have your values kind of clipping up here. Your brightest pixels are not all the way, and your darkest pixels are not all the way down to the bottom. So how would you increase this? You would want to, pardon me, there we go. You would want to be able to stretch this out, make the dark pixels as dark as they can be. So that would be this area right here. You want that shadow to be as close as possible. So using the lumetri color control, which, like I said, we're gonna play with here. If you wanted to use a LUT, though, with this camera, I wouldn't bother. So in this case, we're not using a LUT, but if you did, you could, if you had one that you could apply. None of us are using RE cameras or Alexas or Phantoms. So there are some built-in ones here. If you apply them, you'll see that they basically will do remarkably dangerous things to your footage. If you wanted to make a white balance move, you could move the color temperature cooler or warmer. If you find that you want to reset it, you can just double click this and it will reset that to 0. Same with tint. You can move the tint scale around to adjust that. But now we're starting to get to the meat of this. If you just wanted to adjust contrast overall to increase this, you can actually just pull this control, and what you see happening is that the edges are kind of pushing out. The brightest pixels are pushing closer to totally bright, and the darkest pixels are pushing closest to black. Whereas the opposite would be reducing contrast. So if you're moving contrast, and you can kind of tell when you get to that point that this is probably the right amount. If for some reason the picture was overly dark, you could adjust exposure. And what you'll notice is that when you adjust exposure, it doesn't really change the darkest pixels. But so you can use these scopes to help you kind of bring in the maximum amount of contrast out of your video. So you can bring up exposure to where it makes those brightest pixels just shy of being 2. These are almost perfectly white. You can increase contrast at that point, which is going to basically make the middle gray areas as wide as possible. It's going to push a lot of the darkers to dark and the brighters to white, so that there's larger areas where you have dark pixels, light pixels, and striking contrast. Highlights and shadows and so on. Again, you can modify just the pixels at the upper end, the middle, or the lower end, and you're just basically raising and lowering the values of those pixels. So if you wanted to make the whole scene as high contrast as possible, I mean, that's pretty severe, but you can do it. You have the ability. With great power comes great responsibility. So but you should generally work your way down from the top to the bottom when you're working in this, generally speaking. Not always. Sometimes you'll want to start with I want to crush my blacks, and so you can take your black slider and move your dark pixels until they're all the way at the bottom, and then you might work on contrast from there, where you're pushing more pixels to from this area down. You have an overall saturation. If some certain cameras will basically they capture at a low saturation. So if your sensor does that, you can generally increase the saturation for that until it looks a little more to your expectation. Again, looking here, so to David's point, actually, in terms of the number of screens you look at, this screen, this projector looks different than what I'm looking at. If I look at here, which looks different than what's on that screen in the back of the classroom over there. Every one of these screens are going to give you a different look of the footage. So don't get so caught up in, oh, it looks great on my screen, so it must look great. That's part of the reason why we use scopes, is because the scopes are they're going to look the same no matter what screen you look it on. The scopes are going to show you that the values of your pixels are what they are. And it doesn't matter whether you do this on a crappy $20 monitor that you picked up off of eBay, or the $4,000 monitor that you mortgaged your house to buy, whatever, okay? I mean, the scopes will never lie to you. The numbers don't lie. All right. So that's basic correction. Creative, you can look through the looks. There's plenty of different looks in here, and you are, of course, welcome to play with any and all of them as you wish. There's no rhyme or reason. Some of these are film looks. If you wanted to simulate the look of a film stock, there's plenty of those as well. So you can get the response of a Fuji, or there's some Kodak settings. There's also these, kind of, these are more like what you'd find where you're like, I want to make everything look bleached. Okay, well, there's several, high dynamic range, low dynamic range. And I think this is neutral or in between. So you get it. And then you've got a day for night preset. So if you shoot basically, a day for night sequence, and you want to quickly get a nighttime color cast to it so that it looks moonlit, because people generally associate, if you shoot it in the dark or you shoot something that's meant to be at night, it's going to be more blue. So this is, I mean, again, the world is your oyster. Enjoy yourselves, knock yourselves out here. If you want, you can actually pick a look. Say you really were into day for night, even though this is broad daylight, and you want to just blend that back into the original. You can actually slide this intensity slider, which will kind of cut the amount of the look that is applied to. It blends back the original footage back into this, so you can kind of go, whole hog or no hog. Okay. Even if you don't do this, you also have this, like I said, again, faded film is such a common, this kind of where the contrast range is actually compressed because it's old film look or something like that, whatever. You do have a basic sharpen that if you over apply it, you can see that it is it's showing you the areas where it's sharpening, even though this is zoomed out. If you were to look at 100%, you can definitely see some aliasing here on the edges of those bricks. Whereas if you remove it, they're a little less crisp. So maybe you find just the right amount of sharpening that you can apply. But yeah, generally when you look at sharpening, you can definitely see that the areas of contrast are where there is contrast between light, bright, and dark pixels that is exaggerated with sharpening. Let's move on to the curves. So the curves group right here. So again, if you're accustomed to using curves inside of Photoshop, you can apply, your contrast curve this way. Let me move this back out to a fit so I can see what we're doing. So if I wanted to, and by the way, if you ever needed to see how each group applies to your image, so you see that the basic correction did that for us. If you wanted to turn that off temporarily and then see how just this one adjustment was affecting it. You can disable parts of these different stages and then re-enable them. If you ever needed to remove these, oh, come on, which is the, oh, there it is. Hold down the control or command key, and you will see that the pen changes from a plus to a, or from a, you know, a node adjustment, which is where you can move it. If you hold down, I'm holding down the command key on the Mac, it changes to a pen with a minus sign next to it. You click and remove the node. You do have curves for each of the three red, green, and blue, so you can just do a color move to red. And maybe you can say, well, we want to de-emphasize the greens a little bit, maybe, or maybe we want to emphasize them because it's more yellow, but not in the shadows so much, just in the highlights. And then the blues, we're going to take some blue out of this to warm it up some more. And there you go. You've now got 3 color curves applied. Notice that I didn't move them exaggerate. They're not big exaggerated moves off of that center line. Less is more. But to that effect, what I'm going to do now is I want to show you this hue curve, or this hue adjustment. This one's fun. So say, for instance, you wanted to isolate your bricks. You could just deal with the hue on those bricks. So you can actually move your reds and desaturate just your reds. You can pump the saturation up in your reds. You can actually tighten this up so that everything except red is affected. Notice that you can't move outside the bounds. It's really just bounded between these points. If you wanted to desaturate that blue area back there, maybe you were like really annoyed by the fact that there's this blue part down there in the back, you can kind of come over here and either desaturate it or kind of move it towards a more purplish or a more green. You can't change the color hues here that easily, but you can apply curves to just saturation moves to just certain color ranges. So this is a pretty interesting capability that's not necessarily easily available to you. So you'll notice that as you move these around, you can actually click on ranges. So if you know that you're working in greens or cyans or blues or purples or reds, that you can actually add those color ranges to this. So if you wanted to add yellow or remove yellow, you can do that. Okay? So color curves, a lot of fun. You can monkey around a lot. You know, your mileage may vary as always. So I'm going to pop these off real quick and then move on to the last group. Well, actually, the last group that's we're going to really get into. Color wheels, where you've got, this is again where, remember in creative, we did have the warm up or cool off the shadows and warm up the highlights. So you can do that with this capability. It is absolutely available to you. If you just double click, you can reset this back to what it was before. Color wheels, again, this is the same sort of same thing we were doing with the 3-way color corrector. You can apply a color cast just to your shadows, cooling off your shadows, warming up your midtones, and actually this is kind of like the amount, this will change the amount of brightness overall for each of those ranges. So again, double clicking will reset the color control so that you can kind of, if you need sanity. This is actually a new group for the more recent one. This is if you wanted to capture, this is what we call a secondary color corrector. You can actually use an eyedropper to capture a certain color range. So again, if we wanted to capture the blue background here, you can actually show, and I just use the eyedropper to do this, and you can actually use this to add color. So you can use the eyedroppers to select a color range. And then when you do that, you can I'm trying to, oh, here we go. So if you wanted to show what pixels you were messing with, you can see that these are the pixels that you've selected by using this eyedropper. So if you wanted to select more pixels in that range, you can just use the plus dropper tool to kind of pick those. Now you've selected a lot of the blue pixels in that range. So now you can actually warm that range up. And of course, it's not as strong as I'd like, but I'm trying to make a strong move so that you can definitely see what I'm doing. So yeah, I mean, I'm now making something comically bad, but you can see that I've made a gigantic and severe color move over in those pixels that were selected. So if you just knew a range of pixels that you wanted to adjust, you could use this tool to do that. And this is based on hue, so what color value, saturation, so how much color is there. Maybe you're like, I want to adjust more color, so I want to widen that selection out. This actually widens the actual values, and this is kind of like a feathering of the mask. And then this is your lightness, so basically, what is it, bright or is it dark? And you can also maybe pick up the sign there. Maybe you don't want to pick up the sign. Maybe you use this to. So you can use these controls to help you select just the pixels you want and not the ones you don't. So maybe we want to limit. I'm trying to limit how much of the stuff we're doing here. So once you've selected your range, again, you can choose to warm it up a little bit. Maybe you brighten it a little bit. Maybe darken it a little bit. So you have that ability in this with this tool. You can use it to change the color temperature. So again, you want to warm that whole range up. You have the ability to do it here. All right. And then last is the ability to add a vignette. Again, you can't do anything with the vignette other than just apply it. So you'll see that the amount is there. You can darken the edges or brighten them. You do have a midpoint, but the midpoint is really just talking about how severe the edges are going to be affected. There's a roundness, so you can make it very square or very round. And then the degree of feathering between where the vignette is fully applied and where it isn't. So, and again, once again, you can do that with any of these color ranges. So hopefully you guys feel a little bit. Let's talk about the color here, especially this one, where we see the color is way off in the weeds, or this one where it really, really is off in the weeds. How might you do a color correction on this? So with this one selected and you wanted to adjust the color temperature, you might see that it doesn't go beyond that, but you can actually apply a bigger value than 100. So even if the slider stops at 100 and you need it to go to 11, you know, just like Spinal Tap. How many people seen Spinal Tap? A few of you. All right. So ours goes to 11. Well, this one can go over 100. It doesn't make it look better, by the way. So you might have to add some magenta in there. You're going to be dealing with, now you're struggling up against you're fighting a really tough battle when you're dealing with something so far off. So even if you wanted to try to find a neutral value in here, this is going to tell you this is the best it can do, and it's saying it's applying a real severe thing. So you might be like, well, this is going to be a fun ride. With this one, the exposure is pretty broad, so you might not need to raise it too much, maybe just a little. Contrast is already pretty much maxed. You've got a full dynamic range you've got bright pixels and dark pixels all in one frame. However, you might lower some highlights. You might actually raise some of the shadows to kind of compress this a little bit more. And maybe just desaturating it is part of the answer to your question as well, or the problem. when you get to creative, you can actually, I wouldn't bother with creative with footage like this, but curves could possibly help a little bit. You want to remove some red from the midtones. You might want to add, remove some blue from, well, now we're starting to get somewhere in terms of the rest of this looking a little bit. I mean, that does not look like the walls of the aquatic center. I'll tell you that much right now. So, you know, but as far as you can make the grass look kind of green, you can make the tree kind of look like a tree and not like, but the sky is going to always have this kind of, you know, surrealistic cyan sizzle going on because you shot it with a color temperature that's way out of line. Again, maybe because of the way you're doing it, maybe this is not the right approach. Maybe you want to use this tool, maybe the hue adjustment. So you click on the reds and maybe you just pull some more red out of this. Maybe you broaden it so it's not quite so subtle. Or you choose the magentas and you make more of an adjustment there. So you can add and deal with, maybe you're adding some green, maybe you're dealing with that. So there's the ability to do some mangling here in colors. Color wheels might not help you here. You want to warm up the midtones. Oh, that kind of helps a little bit. That actually almost works. You might want to actually move the highlights a bit warmer too. It still has that electric blue sizzle up there. And then the shadows are kind of okay. This is actually approaching something that might possibly perhaps work. But yeah, I mean, you can see the amount of pain and suffering that we had to go through, especially here where we had to do some crazy stuff there and then mangle and mangle. That's mangling right there. Thank you very much. It doesn't get much crazier than, hey, let's cut all of the reds out of this picture. And that's one way to cut the reds out of the picture. So just so that you can kind of have a sense of what we started with and what we finished with, here's where we started and here's where we got. That's actually not too bad. Don't shoot things at the wrong color temperature. Okay? Because you'll run into this and you're going to be like, my God, it might be easier just to go reshoot that. And you'd be right. You know, because I guarantee you, this is a trade-off. I mean, you know, in this particular case, that color control made a positive difference, but that's no guarantee. Essentially, now we move to a different color temperature problem or color balance problem. This one was shot with fluorescent as a fluorescent color balance, so it's very pink. And you're back to the same problem: is how do you make that look presentable? And the other problem with this one is also, this is what it should look like. This is color balance daylight. So this is the correct color balance. And this is what we got. It still doesn't look good. It's not as good as the correct color balance. Like the white balance here looks perfect. It's really good and it's solid, the good contrast. Here, it's like, well, it's not terrible, but it's not as good as what it should look like. Okay. So, play around for a little bit. The remaining time in the class is going to be doing this. Try to wrangle some sense out of those. You have, again, you do have the correct color balance to work from. This one was shot in shade white balance, which is actually a 6,000 Kelvin instead of 52. So this is going to be warmer. And how would you cool this off if you mistakenly shot something? This is like you went outdoors, you went indoors and you're shooting with daylight, but you had tungsten bulbs or even just regular incandescent bulbs or soft white LED bulbs or whatever they use anymore. And how do you contend with that?
Color correction, quarters.
Well, yeah, reshoot. All right. Anyway, have fun. I will be around to answer questions and hopefully make sense of it for you. Generally speaking, how do you guys feel about using the scopes? Because the scopes here are designed really to help you figure this out. What I didn't really go into and what I didn't actually reference here was when you go, this is the correct color balance for that image. And this is what we managed to do with the color balance of this one. Is you can tell that it's not as good as the correct color balance. It's better, but it's hard. It's not easy to fix bad color. All right.
I had a question about when you have the scopes up and you have the top and the opacity, you have that healing brush. Is there like a comparable healing brush? No.
No. I mean, this tool, again, you can use the mask to apply just to certain regions of the frame. That you can do that. But again, or you can use the HSL secondary, that thing that I showed you, the second from the bottom in the volumetric color control. Yeah, that one where you can select a range of brightness, color, and saturation. And then that will follow that. It will apply that correction no matter what pixel. So if those pixels fall under that range, it doesn't matter whether the camera's moving or not, the color correction will apply to it. That's actually kind of the secret sauce for really kind of moving color correction into a new, to a higher level. Using secondaries in that way, where you're selecting certain color ranges and just doing color moves on those, that's pretty powerful stuff. And if you can apply, and don't get the sense that you can only apply one lumetri color to your clip, okay? You can apply it multiple times. So if you come in here, you can apply lumetri more than once here. So as long as it's not selected, this will show you the first one. You also do have the ability to work in the master clip. So you can apply lumetri color to the master and to the sequence. But if you need to do it more than once, you can actually just drag it from the effect panel. So let me bring this back up. So you got lumetri there. You can go back to effects and you can add it again. And now you have a second lumetri color control group. So you have this one here and you have that one there. So once you apply the bottom, I'm trying to see here is there a way to apply it to get back to the previous one? I'm not sure there is. Let's see if I can find that. So for also when you deal with the lumetri color, the thing to take away from this is that all of these groups are actually also show in this under the effect controls pane. You have basic correction. They're not as beautifully laid out as they are over here in the pane, but they all have the same settings. So if you want to do curves, you have your curves control. If you want to do color wheels, you have your color wheels. So you can work in the effects controls area, even if you apply, because if you apply multiple lumetri color effects, you see that the one that we applied originally is not accessible to you. Okay, so you have, you only have the one for, so yeah, if you apply it more than once, then the bottommost one, the last one that you apply, is the one that's visible. because the minute we remove it, you'll see that the one comes back. Yeah. But yeah, if you want, you obviously, like I said, you have the ability to use the Lumetri color with a mask of whatever shape you want. It can be this. You can actually add more than one mask, so you can create weird shapes however you like. You can invert the mask, so then you can get really interesting intersections between this mask and this one. So there's lots of ways, and this works with all effects. Again, this is not exclusive to Premiere. This is how it works in After Effects as well, is that you have masks that that interact with each other. Okay, I'm through talking. Gonna walk around, listen to you guys. That is the conclusion of the educational content of the night. So you stick around, ask questions. If you guys are comfortable with this, you're good to go. I'll see you next week. If you have any questions at all, hit me.
So I see what you're talking about when you have a huge mass. Yeah. So it kind of makes it kind of a red mask. But then I think I have is that the one where you have your.
Yeah, the number next to your name.
Try to match. Try to track it.
Well, I don't think I want to track it because I'm gonna go. By the time you get to that.
Okay, but tracking it would move it up. So that's one thing that just do forward.
Right now it's asking this.
Mhm. There you go. It's following, but it doesn't have to
Oh,
match.
it just keeps it
No,
on
it's
there.
not.
Oh.
No, it's kind of there at the edge. So you see it's still there at the
Yeah.
edge. So now if you look at where the mouse pad is, you see it's still there.
Oh.
So that's what it did. Move that mouse.
Use the mask just to keep it off screen.
Yep.
Then if I dump the information there, it should stay.
Mhm.
Right? And then if I- I was wondering if that little covering thing.
Well, I didn't even see you do it.
Did
you say,
orange, a little more red?
Yeah,
I thought
so-
this was gonna do that, but.
Wow.
I'm glad I have that screenshot so I can think of it. Dude, I should put like legit.
And it
So
was, it's better than it was before.
Well, in that case, you probably do want to work this way. But unfortunately, you're going to be dealing with, well, it's turning, you're raising the red for everything.
Yeah. And maybe if I do the same thing with the mask. Where is it possibly then added more red?
That's another way to do that. Okay.
Do you want these two sequences?
Now, this was in past. The other one is always, you always do the assignments of.
This is new. This year, I'm trying this where I have you guys do some stuff in class that will very closely mimic the stuff that the school work on. In your home. But it's not related exactly to it. So it's not like you're doing it homework in class.
Right.
So there's no assignment for next week yet, or is it?
No, I'm gonna go enable it.
Okay.
I got it. So
Um,
ridiculous. I know. So Laugh it up.
I'm not laughing, I'm just listening.
Laugh it up, like,
Okay.
oh.
Like, there's a weird clip at the end, I think it did. Always would start super loud. And
I've heard them all.
yeah.
You cannot believe it.
Yeah,
Don't
that
expect
is-
it to be perfect. It's okay.
No, yeah, yeah.
So about the
Hard
target
to
sports,
see.
usually,
How much?
Yeah, what did you say?
all turn it, go out and
Lighting shit.
So what I'll do is I'll sign it, and then I'll scan it.
That music
But
video?
it's
Perfect.
not only that.
Yeah,
Use my-
or Adobe Reader, whatever works best for you.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Well,
cool, thank you.
Well, that's what I'm
I'll remind you
trying
to
do.
wait.
for me and my equipment.
Well,
I
there's
work for the-
an episode about the brown.
Oh, yeah.
Because I don't
So that's why we're.
Brown note.
When
Look at
they're
the brown
touching-
note.
well-
Brown note.
Also,
Okay.
the homework stuff, whatever, and stuff I should.
That's- and we go on the assumption that you have-
Yeah, check it out. The video I am breaking on. Don't listen to that brown noise too long.
That's my bottom line.
Yeah.
Basically.
I just feel like there's nothing.
Yeah, no, that was last week. I mean, the key right now is last week was that you can do some basic.
Yeah, exactly, that's the way I feel.
It used to be you just apply effects. Sometimes you could not really-
Oh, I'm good.
It seems like
I'm really good.
No,
The whole thing is it's like watching somebody
One thing that you do.
kill himself for 50,000.
Surprise, it tries to intelligence.
I just don't want to watch it. I know that sounds weird, but he does very stubborn and he does exactly the wrong thing. He goes in exactly the wrong direction, exactly the wrong thing.
See where they-
Got into 80.
All right.
Yeah, he's probably just so stubborn that he just had his leg amputated. He's had, in the last 2 years have been horrible. He ended up in the hospital, pneumonia, almost died. And I'm just like,
Yeah.
let me just detach.
Clearly, I got my gender.
Don't want to be doing when you're 85 years old, you know?
You know, I'm not, if the instructions are not clear, that's my fault. But, the goal is to.
I've never been part of that.
I'll rise up.
You should hear my buddy's
Not necessarily sentimental, but a certain sense of helping when I realized that he was.
That's a new album. It just talks about like police brutality, like all this crazy shit.
About himself. So I'm just kind of here being the witness, and I'm the only one of my sisters.
As long as you. put
Yeah,
that
I'm
down
happy,
and
dude.
try-
Yeah.
That's
They're trying.
I've seen, trust me, I've seen lots.
I just
It's
trust
just
it.
time.
I
go
my
and
grading
other
is,
places.
did you demonstrate skill? Yes, great, good. So I don't.
Oh,
God, you used the wrong part of the video.
That's
Zero
right,
marks,
that's
no.
why I wanted
Yeah,
to.
he's had a great life.
Okay, cool. All right.
Yeah. My
All
grandma
right.
was 8,
All right.
92, his
I'll
mother.
go back.
I'm trying to.
I
The
love
woman
it.
was sitting in the front, and it's like,
That's what it's like.
Really?
okay, I don't see one.
All right.
That's why you see
Yeah,
so
well,
many
I'm
crashes.
trying to get to be like, I don't want to be 107, because I still feel like I'm a lot of.
I saw a really
stuff
effed up one recently. I saw these two dudes try to lift one off at an air show and went straight into the crowd.
Right.
Yeah, like a big like RC fucking drone thing, like straight into the crowd.
And also not stuff that is going to like,
I should go, oh, I should change it.
yeah.
Maybe listen to it.
No, no, it's not on the lens, it's on the thing.
Well,
I don't know what that is.
no, there was a point at which my dad told me, he says,
No,
I
I
was
see
taking you
it.
down to a doctor's appointment, this for like 5 years ago or something. So, maybe 3 years ago. So I'm driving down there, he's got this book, he's reading
No,
about
I haven't seen this at all.
chakras and reverse the aging process. Now that sounds fun.
There's no
Yoga
effect on
now,
narcotics.
and all that chakras.
Oh, yeah.
That's really cool, and I like the idea of all that sort of stuff, but He was like reading the book like this.
Yeah, it looks
So
like
I
a
would
stain
see
on
what
it.
he was reading. I'm like,
Yeah.
whatever.
It's like
you know,
so
let's just-
geometrically perfect.
Yeah,
It doesn't
yeah.
seem
Doctors
reasonable
can't
now.
tell
It actually
everything.
is not.
It's almost like the pixels have had some burn in or
It's
something.
all about
That's
health,
weird.
Everything, which he doesn't. You know, I mean, some of the stuff he does, but most of it he doesn't. So he's just has to come to terms.
He's
He's gonna die. Yeah, we're all gonna die, but how you choose to die, that's something else.
Maybe it's just-
Everybody gets to choose, you know?
Yeah.
Well, that's good.
Yeah, no shit, huh?
Yeah, right. Okay, here's my project.
What?
At first I was thinking.
Oh, yeah, I gotta give her my,
Like, I don't know what it is with Linda and me and zip files.
Yeah.
The Linda's working, so we've gotten to that point where we can get the exercise files. We've gotten to that point, but now whenever I download the zips,
Mhm.
I mean it just gives me, it says failed over and over again. Over and over again. I mean, I can show you on the computer over here. This entire class, I've been trying to download the exercise files and open the zip, and it just keeps saying fail, fail, fail,